is a time coming when many things will change. Strangers called Earthmen will appear among you. Their skins are light-colored, and their ways are powerful. But I have seen them, and you will find that they come true. Sweet Medicine, first chief of the Cheyenne people.
Black Kettle saw the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. He perceived that there were too many white people, that even if the Cheyenne and other tribes could match them firepower for firepower, there would still be too many white people to defeat in the end.
In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln invited Black Kettle and the other peace chiefs to the White House as a symbolic stance for peace on the Southern Plains. Chief Lean Bear spoke on behalf of the Cheyenne.
He was ready to hear what the president had to say, had no pockets in which to hide his words, but would treasure them in his heart and would faithfully carry them back to his people. Words of Lean Bear as reported by the Washington Evening Star, 1863.
Lean Bear was very proud of the medal that Lincoln gave him and the piece of paper that certified that he was a chief friendly to the whites. He came back home, however, to increasing tensions and ultimately hostilities in Colorado.
U.S. officials stationed near western settlements had other ideas about dealing with Indians. A year after their Washington visit, Lean Bear and Black Kettle were approached by U.S. military troops while hunting buffalo on the Kansas plains.
Lean Bear volunteered to proceed ahead toward the troops, holding this document in his hand to show that this was the group of Cheyenne that were at peace, they were friendly. But when he got within rifle range, the troops fired on him and killed him.
The death of Lean Bear immediately touched off a mighty war, a war that meant the beginning of the end for the Southern Cheyenne.
My brother Lean Bear died in trying to keep the peace with the whites. I am willing to die in the same way and expect to do so. Bull Bear, Cheyenne Dog Soldier, 1863.
The blatant murder of Chief Lean Bear set the Kansas prairie afire, and leading the inferno were the powerful Dog Soldiers.
After Lean Bear was murdered by U.S. troops, the Dog Soldiers went on a revenge rampage throughout Kansas and committed many attacks upon white settlements and upon the white transportation. And this was essentially what is called the Indian War of 1864.
It was against this background that Colonel John M. Shivington, the senior military officer in Colorado Territory, had ordered his men to kill Indians whenever they could be found.
Colonel John M. Shivington was an authentic war hero. He was also a fire-eating Methodist preacher. He also was a very ambitious man. Shivington had very uncomplicated views of Indians. Kill them, get them out of the way.
Colorado Governor John Evans also shared in Colonel Shivington's philosophy that all Indians were a threat to miners and settlers, and more importantly, a threat to their careers.
Evans and Shivington didn't care what Indians they attacked, what Indians they killed. Evans and Shivington, both with an eye toward their own political futures, also realized that dead Indians ensured live white voters.
Colonel Shivington raised a volunteer regiment from the bars and brothels of Denver to war against the Cheyenne. They were called the Colorado Third, better known as the Bloodless Third.
Colonel Shivington's ambitions depended on military success, and he was determined to use that Colorado Third in order to further those ambitions.
Shivington's troops pursued the Cheyenne Dog soldiers who continued their revengeful raids across the plains. Black Kettle, however, continued his pursuit for peace. In a daring move, he requested to meet with Major Edward Wynkoop, the commander at Fort Lyon.
We heard that you have some prisoners at Denver. We have some prisoners of yours which we are willing to give up, providing you give up yours. Black Kettle and Other Chiefs, 1864.
They worked out a deal whereby Black Kettle would get some white captives held by the dog soldiers, turn them over to Wynkoop, and they would all go to Denver and have a peace council with Governor Evans. Black Kettle didn't have those captives under his control. He had to go buy them from the dog soldiers, using his own horse herd as the medium of exchange. He did this, very conspicuous evidence of his commitment to peace.
Impressed with his peace offerings, Major Wynkoop escorted Black Kettle and other chiefs to meet with Colonel Shivington and Governor Evans. However, the two politicians of Denver were not pleased with Wynkoop's move.
There was a meeting held at Camp Weld in Denver, and the interrogation by Evans and Shivington was pretty hostile to the Indians.
I am not a big war chief, but all the soldiers in this country are at my command. My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms. Colonel John M. Shivington, 1864.
White Antelope spoke on behalf of the Cheyenne, making a solemn pledge for peace.
The Cheyennes, all of them, have their ears open this way. They will hear what you say. White Antelope, Peace Chief, 1864.
Black Kettle and White Antelope left the meeting with high hopes for peace. They were told to set up their camp along Sand Creek in eastern Colorado. They thought they would be safe.
Black Kettle, through his good intentions, was placing his people at the mercy of two of the most ruthless and amoral men in the West. Black Kettle and his people camp at Sand Creek near Fort Lyons. They feel secure and safe. Negotiations are ongoing. An agreement will be reached. But Evans and Shivington feel just the opposite. Shivington's ambitions now lead him to plot a deadly and vicious assault on the peaceful Cheyenne village at Sand Creek.
Colonel Shivington viewed Major Wynkoop as an Indian sympathizer and a threat to his assault. Thus, he was removed from command of Fort Lyon. Other officers also protested attacking peace-abiding Indians. However, Shivington was adamant.
Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Colonel John M. Shivington, 1864.
At dawn on November 29, 1864, Colonel Shivington and 600 men from the Colorado regiments made their surprise attack on Black Kettle's sleeping village.
People who had gotten up early that morning saw the troops on the horizon, including White Antelope himself, and he thought that it was a mistake. Surely it was a mistake, because they had been told to camp here where they were assured safety. But when the deliberate attack began, he still thought he could stop the troops, and he ran out and cried out in his broken English to stop. And when White Antelope saw that it was a deliberate attack, he stood and began to sing his death song.
Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains. White Antelope.
White Antelope was shot dead as he stood in Sand Creek. Panicked, Black Kettle then took his Stars and Stripes flag, once given to him by the U.S. military, and raised it above his teepee to prove they were peaceful Indians.
He told his folks, don't get alarmed and don't be scared. He said, come to me. I'm going to raise this flag. We were promised that if I did this, that they would not attack us. So he did. He hosted the flag, and still they came, you know. And they showed signs of no hostility, but still they were attacked.
They sent out a little girl, about 6 years old, with a white flag on a stick. She had not proceeded but a few steps when she was shot and killed. Robert Bent, half Southern Cheyenne, Sand Creek, 1864.
Black Kettle, like all the others, thought that the only thing to do was try to escape. He made good his escape. His wife was separated from him, and she had a more difficult time. She was shot numerous times, although she did manage to survive.
When the firing ceased, over 200 Indians, mostly women and children, were brutally murdered. Even before news of the bloody massacre flowed across the country, it had already left a permanent scar.
Shivington comes into Sand Creek and deliberately massacres women and children. But beyond that, after these people are massacred, private body parts are cut out of women and children who were just indiscriminately slain. That just set such a bad feeling among the Cheyenne.
They rode into town holding aloft their ghastly trophies, the parts of bodies, the scalps they had cut off. People cheered them. They were the heroes of the saloons that they had come out of before they put on the uniform of the United States Army and marched off to commit murder. But their hero status didn't last for long.
Humanitarians in the East, as well as the U.S. government, were horrified by the Sand Creek tragedy. As a result, in 1865, an investigation was ordered.
Major Edward Wynkoop, who after he was fired from his job at Fort Lyon by Shivington, when he learned of the massacre, he arranged to be sent back to Fort Lyon, and the first thing he did was start taking testimony from people who had been there.
Colonel Shivington, of the most disgusting and horrible character. Dead bodies of females profaned in such a manner that the recital is sickening. Major Edward Wynkoop, 1865.
It was a total breakdown that goes right to Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington, and they should have been severely punished for what happened. Shivington, of course, is out of the Army right after the massacre at Sand Creek, and thus he is beyond the reach of a military court-martial. Everyone knows he's committed crimes. The Sand Creek Massacre is one of the great blots on the history of the United States.
The investigation proved to be futile. Yet for the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, the only revenge was warfare.
Although wrongs have been done me, I live in hope. I have not got two hearts. Black Kettle, 1864. If your men, your soldier societies, should be scared and retreat, you are not to step back, but take a stand to protect your land and your people. Sweet Medicine, First Chief of the Cheyenne.
I think one of the things that set the Cheyenne apart is they simply wouldn't give up. They would not be indentured, they would not be enslaved, they would not, I mean, they'd die first. They didn't care, they would die first.
The Fighting Cheyenne were considered one of the greatest warrior nations of the 19th century. However, their origins began peacefully hundreds of years earlier in the woodland country of Minnesota. There they were farmers and small game hunters.
It had been the white man's horse and the white man's gun that had brought them onto the plains, brought them to the buffalo chase, and made them into the great Plains warrior tribe.
It was the combination of guns and horses that led to the Plains tradition, which became one of the most exciting and dramatic so-called primitive cultures ever recorded in the whole world. So here in the American Great Plains, there was a century of this brilliant, nomadic, equestrian culture living on buffalo and the other game.
By the 1700s, the Cheyenne had followed the buffalo onto the western plains of what is now North and South Dakota. Early European explorers and fur traders were so captivated by the tribe that they called them the Beautiful People.
The Cheyenne were always called by other tribes and by whites the Beautiful People because they were handsome men and beautiful women, taller than most other Indians. They seemed to have a higher intellect than the average Plains tribes person.
There is no finer race of men than these in North America, and none superior in stature excepting the Osage. Scarcely a man in the tribe full grown who's less than 6 feet in height. Horace George Catlin, 1832.
They never showed any mercy to their enemies. And it was pointed out that that was one reason why the tribe was small, that only the strong survived, this attitude the Cheyenne had. And this was a sort of a prophecy.
When Cheyenne people first met white settlers, there was a friendly relationship. They acted as go-betweens between the white settlers who were further east, and the tribes that were further west.
However, fur traders and white settlers moving west along the Oregon Trail disrupted the buffalo herds and forced the Cheyenne to split. The Northern Cheyenne Band remained north of the Platte River, hunting their game in the Powder River country, while the Southern Cheyenne Band followed the buffalo south along the Arkansas River.
The tribe was so big that it was difficult to move and difficult to hunt, and so they divided into smaller groups. There was no animosity in the split when the Cheyenne people became the northern branch and the southern branch. They still call themselves Sisistis, which is the Cheyenne word for Cheyenne.
Once the tribe split, the Northern Cheyenne developed a strong kinship with their Lakota Sioux neighbors.
The Cheyennes were a much smaller tribe. They never threatened the Sioux, but they were so alike that we can almost consider them as one people.
They were very similar to the Western Sioux, the Lakota Sioux. The lifestyle, the dance, the dress, the societies. In fact, there was a lot of intermarriage with the Lakota Sioux.
The Northern Cheyenne, like their sometime allies, the Sioux, were engaged in a constant struggle for possession of the Northern Plains, fighting against the Crow, fighting against the Pawnee. And because of this, their culture had evolved into a very effective warrior society.
Among the Northern Cheyenne warriors emerged two great chiefs, one of them Morning Star, who was better known as Dull Knife.
Dull Knife was really sort of a nickname, in that one of his brother-in-laws, I believe, made fun of him because his knife was always dull, and so they called him Dull Knife. Dull Knife was a respected leader. He led the people both in peace and in war, and I think that his individual preference was to negotiate.
Little Wolf, Dull Knife's friend and comrade, was the other great leader of the Cheyenne people.
Dull Knife and Little Wolf had a real balanced relationship, where Little Wolf was more aggressive and more willing to take chances, particularly on the battlefield, I think Dull Knife was the wiser of the two as far as providing counsel and trying to steer the people away from trouble.
Dull Knife and Little Wolf show up at nearly every major step in the unfolding confrontation between their people and the whites. They participate in the first encounters along the Oregon Trail in 1856 that led to the first conflict between the Army and the Cheyennes.
Continual white immigration across the northern Cheyennes' homeland eventually caused the two cultures to clash. In 1856, a series of small conflicts between the Cheyenne and the military eventually raged into the first all-out war.
The high point of that first Cheyenne War between the Army and the Indians was the so-called Battle of Solomon's Fork. This was a great scene right out of Hollywood casting directors' fevered imagination, because Colonel Sumner and the 1st Cavalry drew up to confront a line of Cheyennes. Almost never did Plains Indians stand and fight. That just wasn't their way of warfare. But in this instance, the Cheyennes' holy man, Ice, or White Bull, had said there is a holy lake here, and if you wash your hands in it, white bullets can't hurt you. So they all did, and they lined up to fight the white soldiers. Well, purely accidentally, I suppose, Colonel Sumner didn't say charge with pistols. He said charge with sabers. And the Holy Waters didn't arm them against sabers. So here was this grand saber charge with flags flying and bugles sounding and sabers extended, and the Cheyennes simply dissolved and fled in all directions.
Casualties on both sides were few, but the battle at Solomon's Fork was just the beginning. For the Northern Cheyenne, the bloodiest warfare was yet to come. In 1864, warfare against the Plains Indians heightened when the U.S. Army attacked a peaceful Southern Cheyenne village camped along Sand Creek in Colorado, murdering mostly women and children. The Sand Creek Massacre sent war cries across the plains, and the Northern Cheyenne sought retribution for the senseless deaths of their Southern brothers.
They had a grand war during the summer of 1865, one that featured the great victory at Platte Bridge, and one that featured a three-pronged and very massive campaign conducted by General Patrick E. Connor all through that Powder River country, in which the Cheyennes and their Sioux friends simply ran rings around these big, heavy military columns.
The Northern Cheyenne were able to fend off the military expedition through the Powder River country. But no sooner had that expedition ended when another one had already begun.
Gold was discovered in Montana and in Idaho, and miners began moving into the region, and the easiest route was right through Wyoming and into Montana. This was through the heart of land that was used by the Sioux and the Cheyenne to hunt and live in. And all of a sudden there's this invasion, this mass invasion of people coming through their land and scaring off the animals.
One of the favorite routes, at least in Prospect, was the Bozeman Trail. This road lay right across the Powder River buffalo lands claimed by the Sioux and the Cheyennes.
In the summer of 1866, a Washington Peace Commission met with the Northern Cheyenne and Lakota Sioux, offering them presents in exchange for the promise of safe travel for whites along the Bozeman Trail. But as the negotiations were underway, the U.S. military was already building a chain of forts in the heart of their country.
Even as the tribes go to engage in this negotiation, they see the troops arriving to go out into the Powder River country, the best hunting ground of the Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne, and build these forts that were to protect the trail to the Montana mines. This was an outrage. Red Cloud, his Northern Cheyenne allies, made it clear that no forts could be built. This set up immediate conflict.
Dull Knife didn't want war, but knew he must join forces with Red Cloud's Lakota Sioux against the military. Immediately, the stage was set for the Bozeman Trail War, better known as Red Cloud's War.
The soldiers were, in fact, besieged within their forts. They could barely go out from the forts to cut hay for their stock or wood for their fires. In fact, in December of 1866, when a woodcutting party was attacked outside of Fort Phil Kearny, a detachment under Captain William Judd Fetterman was sent to its rescue. So worried was the fort's commandant, Colonel Carrington, of Indian entrapment, that he warned Fetterman to stay within sight of the fort and under no circumstances to pursue the Indians out of sight. But of course, young Captain Fetterman, one of many in a long line of young officers with a lot of courage and very little brain, pursued the retreating Indians, who lured him into a trap laid by the Northern Cheyenne and the Sioux.
I was the one sent out to spy on the fort. The soldiers followed fast and were well into the hills before the big body of Indians attacked them. 2 Moons, Cheyenne Warrior, 1866.
The attack was swift. When it was over, Fetterman and 100 of his men were all dead. The Northern Cheyenne called it the Battle of 100 Slain, but the press and the military declared it the Fetterman Massacre.
The Fetterman Fight, or the Fetterman Massacre, as the press of the day called it, was, of course, a battle. Captain Fetterman, with his troops, had gone out and engaged in open conflict with warriors of the Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne. They all died. There were no survivors.
This was an appalling disaster to the Army and to Eastern public opinion. It led directly to a reassessment of Indian policy and the formation of a peace commission to attempt to accomplish through diplomacy what the military had failed to accomplish by force. And the Peace Commission negotiated the Treaty of 1868.
The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie established the Great Sioux Reservation and set aside the game-abundant Black Hills for the Northern Cheyenne and Sioux. Consequently, the military was forced to abandon the Bozeman Trail.
In great humiliation, the Army had to march out and abandon those forts. Well, immediately the Indians swarmed in and burned them and had high carnival. They were hated symbols of white invasion of the Indian buffalo range. And for people like Dull Knife and Little Wolf, the forts had to go.
Although Dull Knife and Little Wolf felt they had won the battle, they would soon lose the war. Within the treaty, they unknowingly agreed that once the buffalo were gone in the north, they would move to a reservation in the south.
No white person or persons shall be permitted to settle or occupy any portion of the territory, or without the consent of the Indians to pass through same. Treaty of 1868.
But in 1874, rumors spread that gold could be found in this pristine wilderness. The government sent Major General George Custer, called Pawhuska, or Long Hair by the Sioux, to investigate. He drove his cavalrymen and supply wagons deep into the heart of the Holy Black Hills and soon reported that they were filled with gold from the grassroots down.
I learned that Pawhuska had found there much of the yellow metal that makes the whites crazy. Our people knew there was yellow metal in little chunks up there, but they did not bother with it because it was not good for anything. Black Elk.
In the Black Hills, there's gold. And the white man saw it as
a money-making venture. We Indians saw it as a beautiful place where we can go and pray and to receive something perhaps that is better than the gold that is in there. A lot of our creation stories and a lot of our Indian medicine came from the Black Hills.
With the buffalo declining rapidly on the Great Plains, the Black Hills and surrounding areas were the last refuge of the Sioux. Custer's report fueled a gold rush. Miners poured into the Black Hills. Non-reservation bands of Sioux who chose to live the traditional nomadic lifestyle were threatened with arrest.
Unless they shall remove within the bounds of their reservation before the 31st of next January, they shall be deemed hostile and treated accordingly by the military force. Edward P. Smith, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, 1875.
In 1 year, these conditions would bring about the most celebrated battle in the history of the Indian Wars. If the Sioux had the equivalent of a Renaissance man, it was Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa tribe. Although not a hereditary chief, he was a holy man. He was a great warrior, he was a hard bargaining politician. He was a composer of songs, and he was an artist. It is primarily through his antagonisms with the white man that we know Sitting Bull. His rise to notoriety started around the time the Treaty of 1868 established the Great Sioux Reservation. Sitting Bull was one leader who refused to accept the terms of the treaty, and bands of like-minded Sioux in northern Cheyenne began to unify under him. They insisted upon living the free life and chastised those on the reservation.
You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of bacon fat, some hard tack, and a little sugar and coffee. Sitting Bull.
I don't think that his followers thought of him as a chief, but rather a cultural and religious leader.
He had that ability to see visions, to understand. Others who don't understand that will immediately say, well, this guy has something and he's a mystery, so he's a medicine man. Well, he really isn't. He had the ability to foresee things, to prophesy.
Sitting Bull's most famous prophecy came during the War for the Black Hills when he called for a sun dance to be held. He had 100 bits of the flesh of his arms cut out, then danced for over 24 hours.
A vision appeared to him while dancing the sun dance of soldiers falling out of the heavens upside down into the Sioux village, which was a forecast of exactly what happened scarcely a month later.
Pursued by U.S. forces, Sitting Bull's large Sioux village, some northern Cheyenne, and some Arapaho moved camp to the river they called the Greasy Grass. Others called it the Little Bighorn. On June 25, 1876, the reckless long-hair Major General George Armstrong Custer led 5 companies of cavalry directly towards their 3-mile-long encampment. Less than a mile from their mobile village, the Sioux met their invaders.
The Little Bighorn was the greatest military triumph the Sioux had ever achieved, either against the whites or against other tribes. They had been acting purely on the defensive, and they had fought only because they were directly attacked and their families were placed in jeopardy.
According to our grandmother, the battle only took about 20 minutes. That's all it took to wipe Custer out.
At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Sioux and their allies destroyed the corps of the 7th Cavalry. Ironically, Sitting Bull, who the press would credit with winning the victory over Custer, did not participate in the main battle. The Sioux were led that day by their great war chief, Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull's contribution was profoundly spiritual.
In his vision, he already foretold that what was going to happen. And all they had to do was just carry it out. Now, we put faith in those things. This is what is going to happen. It's going to happen, and it usually does happen. And that's probably one of his greatest contributions that he ever made in that battle, was that we already knew we were going to win.
But there had been a second part to Sitting Bull's prophecy, a part that the warriors didn't heed.
These dead soldiers who are coming are a gift from Wakantanka. Kill them, but do not take their guns and horses. Do not touch the spoils. If you set your hearts upon the goods of the white man, it will prove a curse to this nation. Sitting Bull, after his Sundance.
The retribution for the Great Sioux victory came with a vengeance. The U.S. Army, directed by Sherman and Crook, employed the same scorched earth policy against the Sioux that had served them so well in the American Civil War. Many men, women, and children were killed. Some of the Sioux chiefs, including Crazy Horse and his followers, surrendered. Sitting Bull took his people across the border to Canada in hopes of maintaining their traditional lifestyle.
So long as there remains a gopher to eat, I will not go back. Sitting Bull.
But after 4 years, the life was too hard. With his people facing starvation, Sitting Bull crossed the border again. At Fort Buford, he surrendered and established camp. He gave his Winchester to his son, Crowfoot, in order that he hand it to the post commander.
I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender his rifle, and this day I've given it to you, Sitting Bull.
In 1883, he was moved to Standing Rock Agency, where his defiant stance put him at odds with James McLaughlin, the agency's tough administrator.
McLaughlin was a man who believed that Indians should become us white men immediately. No fooling around. I'll get you a mule and a plow and you become a farmer. And you can't imagine Sitting Bull as a farmer. He was Indian. He was going to remain Indian.
He was a stocky man with an evil face and shifty eyes. Crafty, avaricious, mendacious, and ambitious. Sitting Bull possessed all the faults of an Indian, and none of the nobler attributes which have gone far to redeem some of his people from their deeds of guilt. James McLaughlin.
Sitting Bull didn't confine himself to the reservation. In 1885, he toured with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West for $50 a week and made an additional $1.50 for every picture he autographed.
He was generous in giving his money to newsboys, bootblacks, and other urchins who hung about the showgrounds. He could not understand such poverty in the midst of the white man's wealth. Don Russell, Buffalo Bill's biographer.
In 1887, Sitting Bull turned down Buffalo Bill's offer of a European tour because he sensed that the government was about to take more land away from his people. He became an uncompromising negotiator.
In one of the meetings that he had with the government, he took some dirt off the ground and he spilt it in front of them. And it's even this much land I will not sell. He did not trust those people. So he personally never signed any treaty.
In 1888, Sitting Bull went to Washington with a large delegation of chiefs to negotiate the sale of 10 million acres of Sioux reservation land to the government. Because of his hardline position, the selling price rose from 50 cents an acre to $1.25. Enough of the other chiefs signed to validate the agreement. Sitting Bull did not.
Indians? There are no Indians left but me. Sitting Bull.
Sitting Bull went back to his family on Standing Rock Reservation. The defiant leader of the Sioux had a final, tragic role to play in the sweeping drama that was reaching its climax on the northern Great Plains. A role that involved another prophecy. A meadowlark told him, he said, that the Sioux would kill him. The freedom-loving Sioux found reservation life prison-like and nearly intolerable.
Within the span of a decade, these people truly did verge on a total cultural breakdown. And it was this sense of demoralization, this sense of collapse of everything that had given meaning to their lives that provided such a fertile soil for the flowering of the ghost dance religion in 1890.
This revivalistic religion had its origin in Nevada, but appealed to all Indians throughout the West who were seeing their cultures vanish. Its prophet was a Paiute mystic named Wovoka, who had a vision of salvation during an eclipse of the sun.
All Indians must dance, everywhere. Keep on dancing. Pretty soon, in the next spring, Great Spirit come. He bring back all game of every kind. All dead Indians come back and live again. All the Indians go to the mountains, high up away from the whites. Then, big flood comes like water, and all white people die. Wovoka.
Short Bull and Kicking Bear were two Sioux who met with Wovoka in Nevada and became disciples of the new religion. At Sitting Bull's invitation, Kicking Bear brought the ghost dance to Standing Rock Reservation.
Sitting Bull embraced Kicking Bear's teachings, ostensibly at least, although there is some question the depth of his genuine commitment and belief in it. But Sitting Bull functioned then as the chief apostle of the ghost dance on the Standing Rock Reservation.
On the banks of the Grand River in the shadow of Sitting Bull's cabin, the Sioux performed the ghost dance with an added militaristic element. They claimed that their ghost shirts would stop bullets. Agent James McLaughlin was furious.
The excitement was very intense. The people were permitted to dance until they dropped, and this daily performance, with very little food, had made them subjects for the madhouse. James McLaughlin.
McLaughlin demanded that the dancing stop. Sitting Bull wouldn't comply. McLaughlin ordered Sitting Bull's arrest.
A very cagey man. He used the Indian again. The Indian was used. He rounded up 30, 40 men, Indian warriors, and commissioned them as Indian police officers and said, here, you go do the job.
Lieutenant Bullhead led the arrest party to Sitting Bull's cabin. With him was Sergeant Red Tomahawk. They rousted Sitting Bull from his sleep before dawn on December 15th, 1890.
Catch the Bear, who was a mortal enemy of Bullhead, burst forth with his Winchester rifle and shot Bullhead in the chest. As Bullhead fell, he turned his own pistol upward and shot Sitting Bull in the chest. And at exact same moment, Sergeant Red Tomahawk shot Sitting Bull in the back of the head, and then just all hell broke loose. They all started firing at each other at very close range.
6 Indian policemen and 7 of Sitting Bull's followers, along with Crowfoot, Sitting Bull's son, died along with the great leader on that cold morning. Another of Sitting Bull's prophecies had come true. He had been killed by the Sioux.
A really tragic finale to this whole senseless confrontation, because the Indian policemen had relatives among those firing at them. And Indian policemen had just shot down and killed the greatest Sioux chief ever.
Somebody comes in the middle of the night and raises cane with you and kills your son, which happened at the same place, then the rest of them would run. And that's exactly what happened. They ran from that place, they ran to Cherry Creek, South Dakota, in that area where Bigfoot was.
38 of Sitting Bull's followers joined Chief Bigfoot and his band of nearly 300.
The death of Sitting Bull created a tremendous amount of turmoil and apprehension among all the different sub-tribes of the Sioux. And they wanted to get away from any place where there were soldiers.
Under the orders of General Nelson Miles, the 7th Cavalry apprehended Bigfoot and moved him and his clearly armed band to Wounded Knee Creek. The cavalry surrounded the Indians and set up heavy artillery Hotchkiss guns on a hill above the encampment. The situation was ripe for disaster.
Women and the ones in their tents, they said they can't sleep because they're scared. And all that time, the soldiers were, 7th Cavalry soldiers were drinking, having party.
In the morning, the cavalry demanded that the Sioux surrender their weapons. A shot rang out.
Neither side intended an explosion that simply happened because of rising tensions that could no longer be contained. When it did burst forth, it was a terrible, violent, hand-to-hand conflict that took the lives of many Indians and many soldiers, and ended with an infuriated soldiery on the hill turning loose with artillery that cut down men, women, and children and leveled the entire village of Bigfoot.
My grandfather, Dewey Beard, they killed his wife and the baby stayed with him overnight. So baby got sick and died. And they don't come out of there as a family. They were killed.
I was badly wounded. While I was lying on my back, I looked down the ravine and saw these women and little girls and boys coming up. I saw soldiers on both sides of the ravine shoot at them until they killed every one of them. Dewey Beard.
When it was over, nearly 180 of the Lakota lay dead, including Chief Bigfoot. They were left for 3 days while snows swirled around them. Then civilians were hired to bury the Sioux in mass graves for $2 a body.
You asked us to throw off the hunter and warrior state. We did so. You asked us to form a Republican government. We did so, adopting your own as a model. You asked us to cultivate the earth and learn the mechanic arts. We did so. You asked us to learn to read. We did so. You asked us to cast away our idols and worship your God. We did so. John Ridge, Cherokee, 1832.
The Cherokees are frequently referred to as the most civilized. But that, of course, is because the Cherokees pursued a conscious national policy of becoming as much like Anglo-American society as they possibly could, or at least giving that appearance. They had a press, they published a newspaper, they wrote a constitution, they had an enviable system of schools supported by mission societies, they had a church membership rate that was as high as the white South.
The Cherokees were, in fact, far more prosperous than the white settlers who were clamoring for their land. They had grist mills and expansive estates, well-tilled farms. They lived in fine houses. Many of them were slave owners. They had adapted well to so-called white civilization.
They had done virtually everything that one would expect of them in terms of being civilized, presenting themselves as scholarly, intelligent, hardworking people. In spite of that, it was an issue that they were still different, and they were still in the way.
They found a very small quantity of gold in North Georgia up around Dahlonega, and when gold was discovered, the white man got gold fever. And unfortunately, the land was owned by the Cherokee people.
The discovery of gold within the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation fueled the determination of Georgians to wrap up this thing very quickly, get the Cherokees out of there and possess their lands, because gold is a fuel even more powerful than rich farming land.
But the Cherokees had no intention of leaving Georgia. They established a capital city at New Echota, and in 1827 had framed a new constitution and elected John Ross as principal chief.
The Cherokee Nation has at length determined to become men and citizens. A few days ago in full council, they adopted a constitution, and you would have been astonished at the etiquette with which they performed this business, according to the rules of Parliament. Thus far are the Cherokees advanced, further, I believe, than any other nations of Indians in America. Reverend Gideon Blackburn, missionary.
When the Cherokees enacted the Constitution in 1827, the Georgians went ballistic because it seemed to them that the Cherokees were establishing a nation within the state. That is, the state of Georgia claimed much of the land on which this new Cherokee nation lay. The state of Georgia began to pass laws to make life so miserable for the Cherokees that they would leave.
One of the laws of the state of Georgia said that anybody who's white, who's not a government official in the Cherokee Nation, has to swear an oath of allegiance to the state of Georgia. And this, of course, included lots of missionaries. Some missionaries stayed in the Cherokee Nation and refused to swear an oath. And Samuel Worcester and Eliezer Butler were two of the American Board missionaries who did that.
Georgia, of course, arrested Worcester and other missionaries, imprisoned them, and ultimately the case of Samuel Worcester reached the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that he had been arrested illegally because Georgia law had no validity in the Cherokee Nation. That is, the Cherokee Nation had won, the state of Georgia had lost.
It is glorious news. The laws of the state are declared by the highest judicial tribunal in the country to be null and void. It is a great triumph on the part of the Cherokees, so far as the question of their rights is concerned. The question is forever settled as to who is right and who is wrong. Elias Boudinot, editor, Cherokee Phoenix, 1832.
But the Cherokees' elation was to be short-lived. President Jackson, who believed as firmly in the sovereignty of states as he did in Indian removal, had other ideas.
John Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it, if he can. President Andrew Jackson, 1832.
Andrew Jackson, in essence, said the Supreme Court can go to hell. Samuel Worcester is not going to be freed unless Georgia says he can be freed. And Samuel Worcester stayed in jail for another year, awaiting his freedom. And it's the only case in the history of the United States where the Supreme Court has been defied by the president.
He refused to enforce the law. And by refusing to enforce the law, he showed that our whole system was a system built, at least in his time, on hypocrisy. And many of the Cherokees now came to realize that the system didn't work, that they had no choice but to agree and reluctantly remove to get the best deal they could. And so the Cherokees now, through white duplicity and through Jackson's arrogance, were driven to deep division and eventually to murdering each other.
As Cherokees became more and more determined to resist Georgia, Georgia, of course, became more and more determined to dispossess them. They divided up Cherokee land, had it surveyed, and made preparations for distributing it in a lottery. Land that was not visibly being used by Cherokee people was distributed to whites, and whites began to move into the Cherokee Nation.
At first, the private homes of the Cherokee were exempt from the lottery. But eventually, Georgia found a way to seize every Indian property, from the humble farmer's cabin to the plantation manor of the wealthiest Cherokee planter. Andrew Jackson declared himself powerless to help the Cherokees, so they were at the mercy of the Georgia authorities. The Georgia militia marched into the capital at New Echota and seized and destroyed the printing press of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. And in May of 1835, Chief John Ross's estate was confiscated, and he and his family had to move across the state line into Tennessee.
Attacked now from all sides, with no recourse, with no one left to appeal to. There arose among the Cherokees a treaty faction that said it was time to make the best deal they could get.
The Cherokee Treaty faction was headed by Major Ridge and his son John Ridge, and included also Elias Boudinot and Stand Watie. These were all, as their names would indicate, mixed blood descendants of European traders from a century before. They were opposed by the full-blood faction headed by mixed-blood John Ross.
I know the Indians have an older title than the white man. We obtained the land from the living God above. Yet they are strong and we are weak. We are few, they are many. We cannot remain here in safety and comfort. I know we love the graves of our fathers, but an unbending necessity tells us we must leave them. Major Ridge, 1835.
Major Ridge was a Cherokee patriot, a hero of the War of 1812. He was a wealthy planter who favored acculturation and an early opponent of removal. His son John Ridge and nephew Elias Boudinot were educated in mission schools in New England and returned home to begin a life of service to the Cherokee Nation.
John Ridge and Elias Boudinot were Cherokee patriots, certainly in the 1820s, when they did their best to argue against removal. But after the Worcester decision in 1832, they believed that the Cherokee cause was lost, that although the Cherokees had won in the court, that Georgia was simply not going to enforce the decision and the suffering of the people would only increase. Consequently, they began to promote negotiating a removal treaty.
John Ross, on the other hand, said, no, we've got to stay. We will win this battle. We will go to Washington. We will fight it in the courts. We will fight it in the halls of Congress.
Ridge and Boudinot and other like-minded people believed that the only way they were going to effect a removal treaty was to take matters into their own hands and simply negotiate it independent of the National Council and John Ross. Ross went to Washington with a delegation, and while this delegation was in Washington, once again presenting the Cherokee case against removal, a small group of unauthorized people met at New Echota and signed a removal treaty. The treaty was clearly a minority treaty. The Cherokee population at this time was 16 to 17,000, and yet the treaty was negotiated at a council that had at most 300 and perhaps only 100 people in attendance.
John Ross found out about it in Washington, and he immediately returned home. He gathered 15,655 signatures on a petition that he took back to Washington, stating this Treaty of New Echota that was signed is not the will of the people. He took this before the United States Senate, and it fell on deaf ears, because on May the 23rd of 1836, the Treaty of New Echota was ratified. It passed the Senate by 1 vote.
The Treaty of New Echota gave the Cherokees 2 years to remove to the west. Members of the Treaty Party went west, but the Cherokee Nation as a whole remained where it was. They began to plant corn in the spring of 1838, believing that at the last minute John Ross was going to work out some sort of agreement that would enable them to stay.
Unhappily, the 2 years which were allowed for the purpose, you have suffered to pass away without following and without making any preparation to follow. Will you then, by resistance, compel us to resort to arms? Will you oblige us to hunt you down? I am an old warrior and have been present at many a scene of slaughter, but spare me the horror of witnessing the destruction of the Cherokees. General Winfield Scott, 1838.
On May the 23rd, 1838, 2 years to the day from the time that treaty was ratified, General Winfield Scott sent 7,000 armed military personnel into the Cherokee Nation to round up the Cherokee people and put them into 22 different stockades throughout the Cherokee Nation.
Families at dinner were startled by the sudden gleam of bayonets in the doorway and rose to be driven with blows and oaths along the weary miles of trail that led to the stockade. Men were seized in their fields or going along the road. Women were taken from their spinning wheels and children from their play. In many cases, on turning for one last look as they crossed the ridge, they saw their homes in flames. Eyewitness, Cherokee Removal, 1838.
After several thousand Cherokee had been ruthlessly uprooted and marched to Indian Territory, Chief Ross convinced the government to allow the Cherokee to supervise their own removal in a more orderly and humane fashion. But even so, their march west was an epic of misery and death, marked by the graves of the perishing.
I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes, and in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and headed for the west. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. I have known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Private John Burnett, U.S. Army, 1838.
Among the dead were John Ross's wife, Quaytee, and his newborn granddaughter. All told, as many as a fourth of the Cherokee died before they reached Oklahoma.
There was a great deal of disease, there was a great deal of suffering. The winter of 1838-39 was a particularly severe one. There was a lot of snow and ice. Not only that, but the drought of the summer and the fall still made water supplies very difficult to come by. It took perhaps 4 to 5 months for each detachment to reach the west.
When they arrived in Indian Territory, the Cherokees received a less than enthusiastic welcome from members of the tribe who had voluntarily moved west before them. These Cherokees were known as the Old Settlers.
The Old Settlers were very, very apprehensive about the arrival of the Ross faction. The Old Settler had already established their own government out here. They had already elected their own chief named John Brown. And they were very, very concerned about the arrival of 12,000 Cherokees because by numbers alone, these 12,000 people owed their allegiance to Chief John Ross.
Also living in the West were members of the Treaty Party, most of whom had departed soon after they signed the Treaty of New Echota.
I have signed my death warrant. Major Ridge, December 1835.
You say John Ridge was prompted by a selfish ambition when he signed the treaty. It is not so. John Ridge signed his death warrant when he signed that treaty, and no one knows it better than he. John Ridge may not die tomorrow, but sooner or later, he will have to yield his life as the penalty for signing. John Ridge, December 1835.
As part of this initial turmoil of uniting the removed Indians with the Old Settlers, the leaders of the Treaty Party, Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and Stan Waddy, were all marked for assassination for having alienated their home ground. And Major Ridge and John Ridge and Elias Boudinot were in fact assassinated all on the same day. Stan Waddy was tipped off and managed to get away.
These people were executed because they had violated a Cherokee law which prohibited the sale of land by unauthorized individuals.
John Ross was not aware that the executions were going to take place. One of his sons was. Allen Ross, my great-grandfather, did know that the execution was going to take place, and he had a part in it. His part was to take his father to visit someone and to keep him away from finding out anything about what was going to take place.
This created a terrible problem in the Cherokee Nation. It disrupted all efforts that Ross had made toward reconciliation, toward unifying with the Old Settlers, and it plunged the Cherokee Nation into a period of civil war that lasted until 1846, when John Ross and Stan Waddy, the brother of Elias Boudinot, who had become the leader of the Treaty Party, when they finally agreed to a settlement, and the Cherokee Nation was reunited.
And one might say peace broke out among the Cherokees in about 1850. And that perhaps was a glorious era for the Cherokee. They had begun to rebuild their nation.
I think it's enormously important to remember that the Cherokee story does not stop with the Trail of Tears. It was a terrible tragedy. The Cherokees suffered greatly, but they refused to be merely victims. They instead triumphed over this terrible disaster. They rebuilt their homes, they rebuilt their farms. The Cherokees expanded the mission school system to a public school system. They even built institutions of higher education that opened in the 1850s. By the time of the Civil War, the Cherokees were once again a prosperous people who had united, who had reestablished their Republican institutions, and who were living a satisfying life in a new homeland.
This war shall be pursued against you if it takes years. Until you cease to exist or move, there can be no other talk on the subject. General James Carleton, 1862.
General Carleton created an experimental reservation system called Bosque Redondo, located near the military post named Fort Sumner.
Carleton decided to remove the Mescalero Apaches and later the Navajos to the Bosque Redondo, to a place that these Indians called Huilte. It is a place of imprisonment, and it was his policy of removal.
In 1863, Carleton decided on a vigorous campaign to round up all of the Navajo Indians, but he needed a forceful and courageous Indian fighter to execute his plan. So Carleton requested the services of the venerated Indian scout, Kit Carson.
Kit Carson was a truly remarkable man. He was one of the most experienced of the frontiersmen. He knew wilderness skills inside and out. He knew Indians as very few did, both as an Indian fighter and as a friend of the Indians.
In the summer of 1863, the Navajo Roundup commenced. Before marching out of Fort Wingate towards Navajo country, General Carleton gave Carson his orders to tell the Navajos.
Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo or we will pursue and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. General James Carleton, 1863.
Kit Carson's job was to make life in the Navajo country so hard that the Navajos would despair and give up. He conducted a scorched earth campaign. He burned their crops, he seized their stock, he burned their homes. He did everything he could to induce such a feeling of fear and insecurity that they would give up. This was Kit Carson's role.
But as Kit Carson marched through this mountainous region, he soon discovered that the campaign wouldn't be easy.
We have the greatest scout in the American West trying to pursue what they believed were about 2,000 Navajos. Now, as it turns out, there are 10,000 plus Navajos, and it is incredible that he is not finding many Navajos. And that's because they know that the soldiers are operating and they pick up and get out of the way.
A father or a headman is always sitting on top of the hills and look out for enemies. So if they see someone's riding horses or a group of horses coming towards, they had to run back down and tell the people and go hide it somewhere. So that's what happened.
Carson is reeling his horse, moving in all sorts of directions, but unable to find the Navajo people. Finally, in the winter, as November comes, the snow starts flying, he determines that they should stop all operations. But Carleton demanded that Carson continue operations on into the winter, and he wanted him to go through the Canyon de Chelly.
Canyon de Chelly was the Navajo's stronghold. Once inhabited by the ancient Anasazi Pueblos, the canyon offered the Navajos a natural defense against the army.
Canyon de Chelly is very important to the Navajo people. A lot of the caves that were there, the cliff dwellings, is where the Navajo people hid out during the time that the United States government said to round up all the Navajo people.
Barboncito, a proud and respected medicine man, was one of the Navajos hiding in Canyon de Chelly. Enduring frostbite and starvation, Barboncito and his clan refused to surrender.
Barboncito is, I think, so one of the great leaders. He's related to me on my daddy's side. He was always a great leader for always believing that Navajo shouldn't be taken away from their land.
In January of 1864, Carson and his troops moved into Canyon de Chelly, accompanied by Utes and Zuni scouts, now enemies of the Navajo.
He begins his troop movement to the Canyon de Chelly. Meanwhile, he sends a detachment of troops north, and immediately this detachment runs into snow, and then they started finding dead Navajos.
They could not build fire to keep warm because soldiers were in the area. The Navajos were starving and they were freezing, so the only thing left was to surrender.
The scorched earth policy had worked. The sick and starving began surrendering peacefully. The U.S. government considered the policy a more humane form of Indian removal than warfare, but not all were spared in Canyon de Chelly.
My grandfather mentions when he was 6 years old in Canyon de Chelly, he said he heard shot down the canyon, and then people start running, and then he looked up, they were being attacked by volunteer army.
The enemies opened rifle fire on the people in the caves. Some people were shot. Some were falling off the cliff. After the fight, the leader of the enemy party broke down and wept, saying, "What a terrible thing we have done to these people." Akinba Burbank, Canyon de Chelly, 1864.
There are numerous stories like this, and I do believe these stories. In the military records, there are only 2 short letters about the removals, and of course, nowhere in there is there any mention of shooting civilians.
After the march through Canyon de Chelly, hundreds upon thousands of Navajos, including the medicine man Barboncito, eventually surrendered at Fort Defiance, a military post located south of the canyon. They were promised their suffering would soon be over. They were unaware their ordeal had just begun. Most Navajos surrendered because they were promised food and shelter. Instead, they were forced to walk over 350 miles in the bitter cold to Bosque Redondo, located east of the Pecos River.
The United States government forced the Navajo people into the Long Walk. This was not of their making at all. There's not a Navajo family that I know whose people were involved in the Long Walk who don't have stories about the forced removal.
There were all these people that wanted food. There was nothing to eat. And they walked and they walked. And if they were not able to walk, if they were showing any illness and any weakness, they were shot down right there. But they still continued.
There were not enough wagons, and so they had to walk. It took between 19 and 23 days to go over there. They talk about the lack of food and medicine, and that the food that they did receive was not good for them. They ate raw flour, which turned to glue in their stomachs, or they ingested it so quickly and it came up into their nose and their mouth that suffocated them. They gave them bacon that was rancid. But worst of all, Navajos in their oral tradition speak universally of civilians being shot to death by the soldiers. Kit Carson led the first group of Navajos toward the Rio Grande. Once he arrived there with his 100 prisoners, he took off and left. The other removals were done under the leadership of other men, not Kit Carson. And it is under the leadership of other people that Navajos feel that their relatives were shot to death.
Bosque Redondo, one would interpret it as a concentration camp. And Carleton's dream was to make farmers out of Navajos. The Navajo did farm a little, but they were basically not farmers. The other problem is that Navajo were just not used to living in one village, like a Pueblo village. That's just not Navajo lifestyle.
The Bosque Redondo was a failure from its inception. Carleton determined to place the Navajos in a very poor location, believing that there were only 2,000 Navajos, and he ended up with 8,000 to 10,000 Navajos. The land could not support such a large population. It was a massive failure. Large numbers of people died as a result of this grand experiment.
They were completely devastated. They wanted to go back home to their beautiful land, and yet they couldn't. The Pecos River was deep at that time, and just coming across that river took many of the Navajo lives. And also, some of the pregnant women, they did not want the babies to live in the encampment, so they threw them into the river. So the river took many lives.
Many Navajos, like the medicine man Barboncito, managed to escape, but he, like others who fled, eventually returned because of sickness and lack of food. However, while thousands remained trapped in the death camp, one Navajo warrior was still on the run.
It is a tradition of my people that we must never cross the three rivers. I was born there. I shall remain. I have nothing to lose but my life. Manuelito, 1865.
On September 1st, 1866, over 2 years after the first group of Navajos made the long walk, Manuelito, wounded and starving, surrendered with his family. 2 weeks later, General Carleton was removed from command. With Carleton gone, the Navajos pleaded with their agent at the reservation to let them return to their homeland.
It became a national scandal. And even people in New Mexico, the whites, began to say, let these people go back to their homeland.
In 1868, Congress appointed General William Tecumseh Sherman to lead a peace commission to determine the fate of the Navajos.
I found the Bosque Redondo, a mere spot of green grass in the midst of a wild desert, and that the Navajos had sunk into a condition of absolute poverty and despair. General William Tecumseh Sherman, 1868.
The Peace Commission offered to remove the Navajos to the Indian Territory, an area that would become Oklahoma. But Barboncito pleaded with General Sherman. He promised the Navajos would forever stop raiding if he would let them return to their sacred land.
After we get back to our country, it will brighten up again, and the Navajo will be as happy as the land. Barboncito, 1868.
On June 1st, 1868, 29 Navajo leaders signed the binding treaty between the United States and the Navajo tribe. After 4 years of misery at Bosque Redondo, the Navajos were allowed to make the long walk home.
I think they were very happy. They were very glad that they returned back to their land. They celebrated, and they sing in songs all the way back.
When we saw the top of the mountain from Albuquerque, we wondered if it was our mountain. We loved it so. Some of the old men and women cried with joy when they reached their homes. Manuelito, 1868.
The Treaty of 1868 is most important because it formed a legal relationship between the Navajo Nation and the United States. And that legal relationship had not existed before. It specified that the Navajos would control a portion of their former lands. But when the Navajos arrived back, we must realize they didn't have their horses and cattle and sheep. They had virtually nothing.
When they returned home, they found nothing but charred hogans, corrals, and the land was so pitiful that they just couldn't bear to live with that.
Between 1868 and 1878, the Navajo endured one hardship after another: severe drought, shortage of livestock, and a grasshopper plague. But no burden was greater than the U.S. government's relentless determination to take away their culture.
The Navajo Treaty is specific on education, and it says that for every 30 children there will be a school. The government of the United States determined to destroy the Indian within the Indian, destroy Indian culture through the children. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs would make raids of Navajo families and take their children and force them into exile at an Indian school. They were mean to them. They would lock the kids up. They had like little jails for them. They could use balls and chains on them, cutting their hair, forcing them not to speak their native language, only English.
I was awful scared when they cut my hair, because hair means rain. You can't dance in the ceremonies unless you have long hair. Student, Carlisle Indian School, 1891.
They thought they could take them away from their family, put them in boarding schools, scrub them white, then they'd go home and they'd forget who they were. But then none of that worked.
The Navajos' spiritual ties to their land kept their culture alive, and after decades of hardship, the people would soon find themselves on the road to economic recovery.
The federal government had finally begun to bring things like they promised: the seeds, the farming equipment, various livestock, and they were growing lots of sheep, lots of horses, lots of cattle, and they were very wealthy. They were really getting rich with livestock. And that is probably the single difference between Navajo and any other tribe.
The sheep was everything to them. It was their way of living, it was their economy, it was their food, it was their security, their future. Each family was given only a few sheep. Now, rather than eat the sheep, the Navajos exist on near starvation and bred their sheep.
The breeding of sheep also allowed the Navajo women to continue their long tradition of weaving.
The Navajo woman wove because of the feelings that she has and because of the values that she grew up with, being connected to nature. And the Navajo woman also felt the necessity to weave to keep her family going and to support her family financially.
The reservation trader was an intermediary between the Indian world and the white world, none more so than Don Lorenzo Hubble, whose trading post at Ganado was one of the most important. Don Lorenzo encouraged the weaving of blankets and rugs that would have a market in the white world. He encouraged the crafting of artistic silver that would have a market in the white world.
By the late 1890s, the Navajo economy and culture were prospering. They turned their reservation into $1 million sheep business, exporting 8 million pounds of wool. But with the demand for wool came a demand for more grazing land. Navajo delegations went to Washington, D.C. to request more land back.
Then as the years went by, rather than forcing Navajos onto a smaller portion of land, the government of the United States expanded the boundary lines continually of the Navajo reservation. And that's because they had not found gold and silver on Navajo land. And for the most part, New Mexicans didn't want to graze in Navajo country at that time.
The reservation was periodically enlarged to the point where it includes probably twice as much or more than it did in 1868. These are beautiful lands. They are sacred lands to the Navajos, but they are sterile lands in terms of their appeal to white settlers.
From complete destitution and despair, the Navajos reemerged as a strong and proud nation. The tragedies of the Long Walk would forever remain a bitter memory. But the Navajos proved
will be reached. But Evans and Chivington feel just the opposite. Chivington's ambitions now lead him to plot a deadly and vicious assault on the peaceful Cheyenne village at Sand Creek.
Colonel Chivington viewed Major Wynkoop as an Indian sympathizer and a threat to his assault. Thus, he was removed from command of Fort Lyon. Other officers also protested attacking peace-abiding Indians. However, Chivington was adamant.
Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Colonel John M. Chivington, 1864.
At dawn on November 29, 1864, Colonel Chivington and 600 men from the Colorado regiments made their surprise attack on Black Kettle's sleeping village.
People who had gotten up early that morning saw the troops on the horizon, including White Antelope himself, and he thought that it was a mistake. Surely it was a mistake, because we had been told to camp here where they were assured safety. But when the deliberate attack began, he still thought he could stop the troops, and he ran out and cried out in his broken English to stop. And when White Antelope saw that it was a deliberate attack, he stood and began to sing his death song.
Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains. White Antelope.
There is a time coming when many things will change. Strangers called Earthmen will appear among you. Their skins are light-colored, and their ways are powerful. But I have seen them, and you will find that they come true. Sweet Medicine, first chief of the Cheyenne people.
Black Kettle saw the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. He perceived that there were too many white people, that even if the Cheyenne and other tribes could match them firepower for firepower, there would still be too many white people to defeat in the end.
In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln invited Black Kettle and the other peace chiefs to the White House as a symbolic stance for peace on the Southern Plains. Chief Lean Bear spoke on behalf of the Cheyenne.
He was ready to hear what the president had to say, had no pockets in which to hide his words, but would treasure them in his heart and would faithfully carry them back to his people. Words of Lean Bear as reported by the Washington Evening Star, 1863.
Lean Bear was very proud of the medal that Lincoln gave him and the piece of paper that certified that he was a chief friendly to the whites. He came back home, however, to increasing tensions and ultimately hostilities in Colorado.
U.S. officials stationed near western settlements had other ideas about dealing with Indians. A year after their Washington visit, Lean Bear and Black Kettle were
out of the way.
Colorado Governor John Evans also shared in Colonel Chivington's philosophy that all Indians were a threat to miners and settlers, and more importantly, a threat to their careers.
Evans and Chivington didn't care what Indians they attacked, what Indians they killed. Evans and Chivington, both with an eye toward their own political futures, also realized that dead Indians ensured live white voters.
Colonel Chivington raised a volunteer regiment from the bars and brothels of Denver to war against the Cheyenne. They were called the Colorado Third, better known as the Bloodless Third.
Colonel Chivington's ambitions depended on military success, and he was determined to use that Colorado Third in order to further those ambitions.
Chivington's troops pursued the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, who continued their revengeful raids across the plains. Black Kettle, however, continued his pursuit for peace. In a daring move, he requested to meet with Major Edward Wynkoop, the commander at Fort Lyon.
We heard that you have some prisoners at Denver. We have some prisoners of yours which we are willing to give up, providing you give up yours. Black Kettle and Other Chiefs, 1864.
They worked out a deal whereby Black Kettle would get some white captives held by the Dog Soldiers, turn them over to Wynkoop, and they would all go to Denver and have a peace council with Governor Evans. Black Kettle didn't have those captives under his control.
Approached by U.S. military troops while hunting buffalo on the Kansas plains.
Lean Bear volunteered to proceed ahead toward the troops, holding this document in his hand to show that this was the group of Cheyenne that were at peace, they were friendly. But when he got within rifle range, the troops fired on him and killed him.
The death of Lean Bear immediately touched off a mighty war, a war that meant the beginning of the end for the Southern Cheyenne.
My brother Lean Bear died in trying to keep the peace with the whites. I am willing to die in the same way and expect to do so. Bull Bear, Cheyenne Dog Soldier, 1863.
The blatant murder of Chief Lean Bear set the Kansas prairie afire, and leading the inferno were the powerful Dog Soldiers.
After Lean Bear was murdered by U.S. troops, the Dog Soldiers went on a revenge rampage throughout Kansas and committed many attacks upon white settlements and upon the white transportation. And this was essentially what was called the Indian War of 1864.
It was against this background that Colonel John M. Chivington, the senior military officer in Colorado Territory, had ordered his men to kill Indians whenever they could be found.
Colonel John M. Chivington was an authentic war hero. He was also a fire-eating Methodist preacher. He also was a very ambitious man. Chivington had very uncomplicated views of Indians. Kill them, get them. He had to go buy them from the Dog Soldiers, using his own horse herd as the medium of exchange. He did this, very conspicuous evidence of his commitment to peace.
Impressed with his peace offerings, Major Wynkoop escorted Black Kettle and other chiefs to meet with Colonel Chivington and Governor Evans. However, the two politicians of Denver were not pleased with Wynkoop's move.
There was a meeting held at Camp Weld in Denver, and the interrogation by Evans and Chivington was pretty hostile to the Indians.
I am not a big war chief, but all the soldiers in this country are at my command. My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms. Colonel John M. Shivington, 1864.
White Antelope spoke on behalf of the Cheyenne, making a solemn pledge for peace.
The Cheyennes, all of them, have their ears open this way. They will hear what you say. White Antelope, Peace Chief, 1864.
Black Kettle and White Antelope left the meeting with high hopes for peace. They were told to set up their camp along Sand Creek in eastern Colorado. They thought they would be safe.
Black Kettle, through his good intentions, was placing his people at the mercy of two of the most ruthless and amoral men in the West. Black Kettle and his people camp at Sand Creek near Fort Lyons. They feel secure and safe. Negotiations are ongoing. An agreement